Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's discussion on the future of online advertising in the European Union. May you live in interesting times is a Chinese proverb. Some say it's a curse, but regardless of interpretation, I think it's fair to say that it applies to our era. Amidst a flurry of technology regulation coming out of Brussels, there is a proposal in the Digital Services Act which has received curiously little attention, a proposed ban on personalized advertising. It doesn't quite come as a surprise that this doesn't evoke the same kind of interest as laws about gatekeepers, competition policy, or AI, because digital advertising is a pretty technical field in which memes and caricatures loom large, while facts and technical details are often overlooked. Which is why I'm really pleased to have assembled today's panel of experts who together can shed some light on the realities of online advertising and examine the policy proposals around targeted advertising in more detail. With us today are Enrico Girotto, Policy Officer at the Federation of European Data and Marketing, Agata Boutanos, European Representative of the Union of Entrepreneurs and Employers, David Ozimo, the Head of Research at the Lisbon Council, Greg Mroczowski, Director of Public Policy at IAB Europe, and Konrad Scheck, Director of Policy Research at the Advertising Association. Thank you all very much for taking part in today's event. The discussion is structured as a moderated Q&A, followed by audience questions. Please submit your questions via the Slido panel under the video on the event page or the Slido link in the YouTube description, and I will try to get to as many of you as I can. So, without further ado, let's begin the discussion. Konrad, let's start off with you. Can you run us through the current regulatory framework for online advertising in the EU?
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for saving the complex question for me, the first one into this webinar. Well, I say that in jest, but actually there's a complex patchwork of regulation which covers online advertising. So you have a number of legislation which covers online advertising directly, and these cover the e-commerce directive, the P2B regulation, you've got the e-privacy directive, and the AVMSD. So that's the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. Now, on top of that, you have broader regulation, which covers everything, including online advertising. So it's not specific for online advertising, but online advertising is captured within this. So you have things like Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. And this is really important because the UCPD also has been interpreted to cover things like native advertising, influencer marketing and advertorials. And then there are other legislation such as the Directive on Misleading and Comparative Advertising. You've got the Consumer Rights Directive, the GDPR, and you've got the Contracts for Supply of Digital Content and Digital Services Act. And that's not to include what's being discussed at the moment, which is the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, and you have the Digital Services Act. And you've also have the e-privacy regulations, which is still going through trilogue at the moment. I hope that gives you a bit of a summary of where we are on regulation of online advertising. And I think it's one of the things, it's quite an important point to make because often you hear myths about online advertising that it's not regulated. It's not the case.
Thank you, Konrad. David, if I may, I'll put the next question to you. In light of this already really well-entrenched and wide-ranging set of regulations around data and advertising, what do you think is the rationale for some to push a ban on personalized advertising in the EU?
Well, I think there is fear. I think what we have seen over the last years since the Cambridge Analytica scandal has raised fears that micro-targeting can lead to manipulation. And this is the fear. And the issue is we don't have a lot of evidence to back up this fear. In fact, we struggle to find any evidence. Even in Cambridge Analytica, the final report of the Information Commissioner in the UK clarified that that was not the case, that it didn't influence the Brexit referendum. And the reality is that there is the perception that that micro-targeting, by acting on people's will, on people's instinct, could actually influence their behavior. But this is also, I must say, the result a little bit of the advertising industry itself. In a way, the Lawfare podcast in the US talks about the disinformation industrial complex. Advertising has convinced us that it is so effective that it has also instilled our fears. But to the best of the evidence available, these fears are not well grounded in reality, and this is a little bit the result of a backlash against technology that you see often in history.
Yeah, Greg, do you have any comments on that before we go into the question of the actual economics behind online advertising, the sort of wider cultural, political context in which this debate unfolds? And you're obviously quite at the forefront of these conversations.
Yes, it's an interesting question. Thank you. I was in fact thinking about that. I think when you said advertising angle, it has received little attention. Sitting here in Brussels, it doesn't exactly feel like that. I think it was one of the four named sort of priorities by Ms. Schaldemose, who's the rapporteur in the main Parliament's committee looking at the DSA. I think the reality probably is we have observed this as a trend over probably 2 decades now, as we've seen also the internet economy growing, and in for instance in the ad tech or just broader online advertising industry, we've seen quite a lot of advancement. So things are not to be compared between, say, 2005 and what we had in 2015 when it comes to the technology, the possibilities, and I think there are a lot of questions around that. Some of them are probably legitimate questions, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we need to go. We need to be radical when it comes to the policy approach. I'm kind of thinking here about some of the suggestions or proposals that are coming from the Parliament around the DSA this year.
Konrad, you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on David's comment, which I totally agree that Cambridge Analytica kind of changed the conversation about advertising, but I often think as well, some of the issues which the MEPs are focusing on, so things like political advertising, micro-targeting, influencing elections, disinformation, a lot of that seems to be focused around political advertising as opposed to commercial advertising. And this is something which, quite keen to make a distinction here, because commercial advertising, although, I mentioned all these raft of legislation, these are statutory instruments at the EU level. I mean, there are a lot of self-regulatory codes. And when I say self-regulatory code, I'm not talking about own company terms and conditions. There are national bodies, which are basically formed of industry bodies who come up with self-regulatory codes, which basically complement with the statutory regulation. And commercial advertising is already heavily regulated in that area. And a lot of the things which I hear MEPs talk about are things connected to what I would regard as political advertising, where the regulation for that is not so clear. So that's just something I just wanted to add to the conversation.
Yeah, Agatha, you represent SMEs and entrepreneurs. Your organization speaks up for them. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing from them about these proposals to ban digital ads as a segue into a conversation around the effects of such a ban on the European digital economy?
Yes, well, I believe that in the current situation, even before we ask, why it's important for the SMEs to use the personalized ads, we should ask why they actually do it. So the SMEs use the personalized ads on social media, since probably it's the only one form of advertising they can afford at this point. Hence, the marketing services in mass media requires budgets, and only large companies dispose of the budgets. Therefore, SMEs use personalized ads because this is the only choice that they have at that point. The way that personalized ads are being used by SMEs largely will depend on the product, service, or type of product that they are offering or they want to sell. Personalized ads allow every company to reach to people with specific interests and in specific location, hence making advertising less costly for them and much more efficient. Maybe what will be interesting for the sake of our today's conversation is giving you a few numbers, how it works in reality, as we are talking about what input we receive from our members. Basically, if we talk about SMEs and their limited budgets to promote their profiles on social media, for instance, a budget of 1,000 zlotys that I see in front of me, which would stand for like 220 euro, let's say, will allow a company to get around 1,200 clicks on their profile. Assuming that 5% of these 1,200 clicks will buy their services and products, there are already 60 potential customers that can rely on their business. It's hard to say whether the 60 customers is a lot without the reference to the product or service that is at the stake. Nevertheless, for us, certainly it should be said that creating the 60 customers from a limited budget of 1,000 Polish zlotys is not possible without using personalized ads. There is no other means simply to do that.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I wanna take the next question to Greg, because I know your organization has done a lot of work on this. The economics behind online advertising, it's a very interesting topic to look at deeper. Building off what Agatha has just described, how do European businesses use online ads, and what value do they derive from them? I guess at scale, on a macro scale.
Well, I think advertising, traditionally has funded the media, and so in the online environment, we can talk about the fact that advertising does support, does provide for this critical support for the online economy, or powers the free and open internet. So that's like one example, and like 81% of the digital revenues of traditional newspapers and magazines who've been moving into the online space does come from advertising. So that's like quite a telling stat to me. But we've been also kind of speaking to what Agatha was just presenting. We've been recently more and more looking at the impact, wider impact, looking at the small and medium-sized enterprises, for instance, and there we discover quite a lot of opportunities, and indeed businesses will want to use it as an enabler. The digital advertising business model as an enabler of their company's business operations. The recently released report of ours does actually illustrate that there are quite a lot of opportunities in the smaller markets, where in the smaller European markets, and for smaller businesses, where traditionally these businesses would be unable to compete with the incumbents. They wouldn't have the big budgets. So that's an obstacle if they cannot really get through with the right message at the right time to a potential client, potential audience. And this is quite important because we are talking about small and medium-sized enterprises, where I guess the overall figure would be stat for Europe would be 99% of businesses. It's SMEs. And maybe one final thing. It's interesting also to observe how advertising could also enable very specific type of businesses, and actually sort of contribute to this priority of the EU as an area not only about as an area with shared values or vibrant local cultures. There, when we talk specifically about some of the products or services that are only present in specific markets. So I'm thinking, for instance, French cheese, right? Again, these may be like really small local entrepreneurs that will want to get through to a specific audience where they may see potential business opportunities, and for them, it's really once more critical to be able to compete with the biggest ones. So I would name these few as good examples, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Let's get to Enrico. I came across an interesting quote recently by Margaret Vestager. She said, "It is legitimate to advertise. It is legitimate to try to find the people with whom you want to communicate." Based on everything we've just been discussing, what, in your view, what effects would a ban on personalized ads have on the European digital economy?
Thank you, Benjamin, for the question. Well, as underlined just now by Agatha and Greg, personalized advertising is a fundamental part of SME and startups' business model. They operate on small marketing budgets, so it's very essential for them to reach and connect with the right audience in a cost-effective way, especially in times of economic recovery like now. So a ban on personalized ads would be a setback for these smaller players. So without the ability to tailor their marketing campaigns to the people who are most likely to be interested in their products and services, while they would face a significant competitive disadvantage compared to large, well-established companies who already have brand recognition and can spend enough for mass media advertising campaigns. So instead of creating a level playing field, a ban would increase marketing costs, would set also additional barriers for small market entrants, and so it would impair their ability to promote their products and services. And at the same time, with less personalized ads, less competition, also consumer welfare would be affected, because it's not with the ban. It's not like consumer will have fewer advertisements. Simply, they will be exposed to less relevant ones, which would make it unable for them to make accurate comparisons of different products and services, but also to have access to some of the free content that is currently supported by advertisement. And another important point is about the structure of the markets. We all know that today digital markets for online advertising are dominated by a few large online platforms. What I find interesting about this proposal for a ban is that often we hear that their objective is to break this dependency of smaller companies on large platforms. And that is definitely an objective that most of us share. But this seems to overlook the fact that these large platforms are also the major players when it comes to contextual advertising. So I'm afraid that a ban would increase the dependency of smaller companies on these platforms, which will continue to benefit of their large data ecosystem. And in terms of innovation, let's just imagine a small tech startup with AI solution for the green transition or health sector. It will be harder for this startup to reach to the right people interested in specific innovative solutions. So overall, I think we shouldn't forget, as also mentioned by other speakers, that when we're talking about personalized advertising, we're talking about a very wide range of different actors, from the very local traditional shop looking for new customers, to an innovative driven company, to the large business, but also online publishers that support media plurality, cultural centers promoting their activities, or a charity looking for donors and members. So this is definitely a one-size-fits-all solution that doesn't reflect the risk-based approach of some this key piece of legislation mentioned by Conrad. And just to conclude, we shouldn't forget that the state of online advertising as it is now is still relatively young. This doesn't mean it can be improved. It can be improved, but also key legislation like GDPR, they haven't been there for too long. So we shouldn't discard them so fast, especially if they are supported by increased transparency for both users and companies, as in the Commission's proposal for the DSA and DMA.
Thanks, Enrico. David, did you have a follow-up comment?
Yes, I just wanted to add on this that we can see targeted advertising, personalized advertising as one type of data-driven innovation, and it's similar to what you see in very different sectors. It's not dissimilar for the dynamics that happen in precision agriculture or in smart metering for energy. It's ultimately to use data to deliver more efficient service. So it's one case, one typical case, I would say, of the type of innovation that we see across the economy that ultimately leads to efficiency and productivity. So I think we should frame it also from the point of view of productivity. We are talking about ways to make a service more effective and more productive. And I think the argument against for putting brakes on instruments that work well, and because they work well, and that increase productivity should be well grounded. We should be very clear about what is the problem, and that's something that, to be honest, I don't see yet a very clear expression of the problem. Because if you want to do something that in this case would reduce productivity, then you better need an argument, because today productivity is something that is so difficult to achieve. I mean, when you look at the economic side, we've been trying to find ways to increase European productivity for a long time, and it's a struggle. So it's something delicate that you need to be careful playing with.
Agatha, did you want to talk in a bit more detail about some of the DSA proposals?
Yes, thank you. I would like to actually connect to what Conrad said in the beginning and what David and Enrico were mentioning. Basically, we do see the difference in approach between the European Parliament and the European Commission. So if we go more deep in the DSA proposal, the European Commission notes that the important role of the digital advertising and the role it plays in the online environment. But also it brings up the risk that come with it. Interestingly, we have there two recitals. Number 52 of the preamble to the draft DSA mentions actually the specific risks that are associated with the digital advertising. And we see there, for example, that advertisement it's itself illegal if it brings the illegal content, or that to contributing to financial incentives for the publication or amplification of the illegal or otherwise harmful content and activities online, or the discriminatory measures. So in the face of the challenges, the European Commission proposes to make digital advertising more transparent so that the users have the information they need, and also to understand when and in what situations then bans should be introduced. Hence, the service recipients should also have the information on the main parameter used to determine whether a particular advertisement should be banned or brings any risk or not. So I think this is the clarification. And then we have the recital 63 of the preamble as well, that also requires the very large online platforms in that case to ensure that there is a public access to the repositories of advertisements that are being displayed on their online interfaces to facilitate the supervision and the research into emerging risk brought about the distribution of the advertising online. Hence, to sum up, there is nothing wrong with the transparency, but we need to go into the very details, I believe, in the discussion on what impacts it have and what is the difference in approach between the institutions and what consequences it will bring.
Yeah, very, very relevant. And in light of this discussion around the impact, if there were to be a ban on personalized ads, we would see a reversion towards contextual ads. Now, for the benefit of the audience, Konrad, would you be able to shed some light on the distinction between the two approaches, personalized ads versus contextual ads, and explain why the former are more effective at driving conversion and why conversion is the end-all be-all from the perspective of the advertiser?
Sure. I'd like to just kind of conceptualize it on a very kind of basic level. When you think about a shopkeeper or even a cafe owner, it's great when you walk in there and the cafe shop owner knows your name, kind of knows what you're after, and thinks about other things that you might be interested and might want to try out. So additional desserts or something to go with your coffee that you've ordered. Maybe you have a specific way that you have your coffee and you like to try some beans and things. So that's the idea of like personalization. And we also see this also within, say, loyalty cards as well. So supermarkets, for instance, people have supermarket loyalty cards. There's information there. And then the supermarkets push information to the consumer to let them know about offers that they might be interested in. So the whole point about personalized advertising is really to understand a lot more about the customer, to understand what they like and try to infer things about what they might also like. If you then take the approach to, say, a contextual ad, you're then only responding to, say, for instance, me visiting a particular website and then just making the pure assumption that I might be interested. So, for instance, if I'm looking at a car website, and then you deliver me a car ad, maybe I might be in the market for a car ad. But if it's just general, I like reading about new cars and stuff, and I have no intention to buy cars, is that a wasted resource by delivering me an ad there? And maybe if they knew a bit more about me, they might have actually sent me a different type of ad that I might be more interested to buy something else. So that's just a way to look at it. Just really what digitalization does, it does this at scale. So it's all about trying to understand a little bit more about the customer and what they're looking for. And also sometimes customers don't always necessarily know exactly what they want to buy at that point in time. And it can be the case that there's a new product which kind of fits in with something that they were looking for, that they can be served up a relevant ad. And it's all about trying to, this is the holy grail of all advertisers and marketers, is to sell their goods and services and hoping that the consumer will buy them. So that's essentially the key differences here.
Thank you for that, Konrad. Greg, do you have a follow-on comment?
I just did want to ask, when we speak, I think about contextual and personalized advertising, it's also relevant to. I think contextual will be relevant, but we shouldn't really think of it as a panacea to all the different challenges on the internet. So that's one thing. But then importantly, let's also try to understand the logic or the business opportunity for contextual advertising from a different perspective, from a publisher perspective. So that contextual advertising does need to, at a very simple level, needs to match the content. And in case of some publications, it will be just very difficult, or these opportunities will be limited. The old example of having an article about an airplane crash and advertising next to it for airlines is one example of why it will not work. But that's in the newspaper context. But if we just think about how limited market opportunities there may be for some very niche publications, or even, if you think about someone having a blog, well-functioning blog, that's something to consider. To consider as well. I think like we want more opportunities and more diversity rather than less, and lead on with the start with limitations. Start with already this limited scope.
Thanks, Greg. Conrad, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, there's another point, and as Greg was talking, it kind of sparked in my head. Where I think the difference between personalized advertising and contextual advertising is also sometimes the lack of nuance. So, as Greg was mentioning, you could be reading an article about a plane crash, and it'd be highly inappropriate that you then get served, ads selling you flights to whatever destination. In the same way, if you don't know a little bit about who you are delivering an ad to, you could make other faux pas. So, for instance, advertising a beef burger to a vegetarian, or sending culturally inappropriate things. So, say, for instance, like for Muslim people or Jewish people who have particular dietary requirements and things like that. So, I think you do have to know, and even with contextual advertising, you have to actually mix it with a little bit of first-party data. So it's not the case of contextual advertising means no data whatsoever. And this is another myth that we've heard recently within propagated by MEPs. That's not the case. There's still data involved in this.
Interesting. Now, what has been mooted as a potential compromise solution in this debate is, instead of an outright ban for personalized ads, mandating an opt-in for personalized ads. Enrico, do you have any views on what kind of impact that would have, and whether that's a sensible compromise to go for?
I think that this proposal to add an opt-in for targeted advertising, first of all, creates confusion in terms of the interplay with the existing mechanism. What I want to say is that it was mentioned before, there are already rules in place, and especially for under the privacy directive and possibly the future e-privacy regulation. For cookies, there is consent as a legal basis to have access to the user's device. So there are different kinds of cookies. Some of them are necessary. Some of them are for measurement. Some of them are indeed for data used for targeting advertising. So in that sense, users already have a choice when they're asked about whether they consent to these cookies. So even here, we see a risk of increasing, adding an additional layers of regulation when it's not necessary. There are already rules in place, so we should focus on enforce these rules, possibly adding additional transparency for the users. But an additional opt-in layer would increase legal uncertainty and complicate current compliance with existing rules.
Yes, and I do think that the interaction of proposed new laws with existing laws is always something that's worth probing, especially given the already dense framework for regulation of data and privacy in the European Union. Greg, do you have any views or research around the opt-in proposal?
Just a word here. I think we need to go back and look how the DSA proposal was. What is it that it was scoped for? And when we look at the impact assessment, it becomes immediately evident that it was not meant to be a data protection reform, and that's something to keep in mind. So this is why we may, well, maybe most of us on this panel would advocate against something that is already in the existing law and should be enforced accordingly. And maybe on that enforcement, we also ought to keep in mind that the law, in particular privacy and data protection law, is interpreted almost as we speak, because many of the data protection authorities, they have been releasing their guidance indeed on some of the topics that are very closely connected, related to online advertising. So we shouldn't also ignore that and add another layer of complexity, which wouldn't be even immediately clear what is it that it is set to achieve.
Agatha, you had something you wanted to add.
Yes, thank you. I wanted very much to agree with the speakers intervening basically just now, and also strengthening that the idea of processing data for the purposes of the targeted advertising should not be seen as something special, and we should not create a separate system, as Enrico was mentioning, which is already happening when we are discussing the DSA and DMA. So rather than from the SME's perspective creating another complex overlapping regulatory framework, we should aim at informing users in a tangible manner and allow them to make their meaningful choices. This would be, from our perspective, more a balanced approach that would already prevent the negative effects for the entrepreneurs and the whole ecosystem that is living around them. Thank you.
So one theme that has emerged from the discussion so far is that a move to ban personalized ads is really an effort to sort of dial back the wheel of time and foreclose one avenue of the digital revolution that we're living through, which is by using data to become more efficient at the delivery of different kinds of services. It's a point that you raised earlier, David, which I think is very interesting, particularly from the perspective of the productivity puzzle that has bedeviled European economies for a couple of decades now. And I was wondering what you see as the sort of right way forward for the DSA to help Europe become a data economy that can embrace the productivity gains that digital tools can offer. What are your views on how the DSA could be amended to make this vision become a reality, especially amidst all the talk of a digital decade in Europe?
Well, I take this as an open question, not as a very I will not give a pragmatic answer on what can be done concretely now at this stage, so late, but I would like to say a few things that I would like to see if I had the magic wand. One is a risk-based approach and a more thorough correlation and proportionality between the risk and the measures. So I think it's very clear that the DSA, when you read it, it's very clear in this area in particular that there is no evidence to back up a stronger in the Commission proposal, that there is no evidence to back up a stronger set of measures. So I would really try to encourage the stakeholder to stick to the evidence as much as possible. We already gone quite far from it in the debate, so in the original proposal, in my opinion, and we are getting further away. The second thing, I mean, there is one thing which I don't like, and I know it's totally out of scope to say it now, and at this stage it makes no sense. There is no practical possibility to change this, but I still have a problem with policy measures where proportionality is not proportionality to the problem, but proportionality to the size of the companies. So I think that policy measures where the size of the company is the overarching principle of designing the policy, leads to the message, big is bad. This is the underarching message, and I think this is a bad message for the European data economy, to give the impression that the bigger you are, the more carefully you will be not only monitored but punished in some cases. So I think these are to us. I know it's not very concrete. I'm sorry. I don't think there is any chance that this becomes a reality. But I think it's very important that policy measures are not just important for the concrete provisions that they do, but for the underlying value they transmit. We know, for instance, that GDPR has a lot of opportunity for data reuse, but the overarching message was don't reuse the data. And I think policies are important also for the message they give to business. We know that also now, we have COP26. The main role is to give a message to business where to invest. And I think giving a message that first, there are risks around. We should be careful about any possible risk, even if we don't have the evidence, even if we have actually some anecdotes and no statistics at all. Not only bad statistics, but no statistics at all. And second, that because the good thing, the way you ensure proportionality is by making sure that if you are small, this law doesn't apply to you, and if you are big, you have additional obligation. I don't think this is a design that fits the digital age.
Yeah, and it's you also raised the point around the sort of ongoing wider discussions in Europe and beyond with how digital policy can be sort of I guess harmonized, or how policymakers ought to conceive of the interaction effects between proposals in different jurisdictions. And I mentioned this specifically in the context of the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, which had its inaugural meeting last month and is supposed to sort of herald a new age of transatlantic cooperation around tech regulation. In the context of banning online ads in Europe and linking this to a wider and really substantial issue on data flows and how we've seen increasing barriers to data flows emerge. What dependencies, Enrico, do you see between the discussion we're having today and wider transatlantic policy discussions around, for instance, data flows, but more widely, technological cooperation?
Well, as a data-driven industry, online advertising is definitely impacted by these discussions on transatlantic data flows, especially after the last year's invalidation of the privacy shield by the Court of Justice of the European Union. For example, the implementation of an online tracker often implies the involvement of providers which are located in the US. So the personal data collected through this technology is either accessed or transferred to the US, implying an international data transfer outside the EU. In this context, I found quite interesting the joint statement which was published after the first meeting that you mentioned in Pittsburgh, saying that the cooperation and exchanges of the TTC are without prejudice to the regulatory autonomy of the European Union and the United States. So with this in mind, after reading this statement, I couldn't help thinking that the discussion on a ban or the eventual adoption of a ban, well, could make more difficult or simply less attractive to the US to make effort to strike a data flows agreement with the EU due to increasing legislative requirements. What I want to say is that the fear here is that the EU becomes an over-regulated island to the point that, companies cannot do legitimate business activities anymore. So I think that if the EU wants to keep its regulatory autonomy while being open to work and cooperate with third countries like the US, should instead focus on, as David said, on legislative requirements that reflect a risk-based approach, which is then the inherent nature of the GDPR when it comes to data protection and data flows.
Yeah, and this is obviously all taking place against the sort of cultural or political backdrop of profiling and targeting and giving users more control in Europe and enhancing sort of privacy protections here. We've seen the application recently now of California's new Privacy Act, which goes some way to embracing the European approach. I was wondering, Konrad, if you have any views on the appropriate design of privacy protection safeguards and frameworks, and where you enter a zone of overkill, or rather over layering regulations on top of each other, and what your view is on how to appropriately scope out a policy framework that balances the need to give users some degree of control and protect their privacy, whilst not sort of kneecapping the ability of companies to target potential customers.
Yeah, it's a very complex question, because we see phenomenon things like the privacy paradox, where people, you could tell them about all these kind of privacy issues, but they kind of shrug their shoulders and are very nonchalant about this, where other people take it really, really seriously. I think it's great that the EU treats privacy as a fundamental right, and I think it's something that we should all cherish on. But there needs to be a general balance, and that one right doesn't override other fundamental rights. And there is a right to do business and enter into commercial activities. I think on the idea of proportionality, I was also thinking about what David said, and I'm going to offer a slightly different view, because I think in terms of proportionality, there are different abilities and resources that larger companies have versus smaller companies. And I think with smaller companies, if you're then expecting them to go through the same kind of compliance as a large company, that's clearly not fair. And I think it's about a case of then designing a framework which is fair and proportionate and respects everyone's interests. I think more research is done in this, the better. The more education for consumers, the better. I mean, there are actually a lot of tools out there which you can use to then control your privacy. So, for instance, using browsers, and there's all sorts of tools and that you can actually control the amount of information that you pass over. You can control the data which is being passed through third-party cookies or in first-party cookies, and et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of people don't know this, and this is something we need to dig into this, because there are tools out there already. Does it necessarily require more legislation to do something? I always come to the conclusion that good legislation is only good if it can be enforced, or if people actually understand it. And I think people don't really understand how to exercise their rights. They don't quite understand the tools. And I think there's an onus on perhaps on industry to do a bit more on the education piece. I don't think it needs more legislation, to be honest.
Well, one theme that also emerges is that there's a scope creep in terms of what the DSA was initially supposed to do, and where we're now ending up. Greg, you mentioned you had a comment on this theme.
Yes, I think it occurred to me as I was listening to David about how to make this this legislation fit for purpose, or at least the final product. I think especially in the Parliament, we are seeing quite a lot of discussion around disinformation, and it's true that in some ways the DSA would at least help to tackle these challenges, some of these content challenges to do with disinformation, to do with maybe hate speech, or even issues such as political advertising that Konrad I think, referenced in the very beginning. And what I think we should be all doing is taking sort of it globally. So on political advertising, I'm not sure if Konrad mentioned it, and or not. We are expecting a proposal by the Commission, a legislative instrument on disinformation. There's a work track also on the policy instrument by the Commission. So again, it's about trying to make sure that we don't add layers of complexity, trying to solve issues that are already being tackled elsewhere, suggesting that some of the solutions, quote unquote solutions, are really the panacea. So I think if we look at disinformation challenge, for instance, we see very little evidence that targeted advertising ban would really solve the issue, and that less data used would really aid eradicating disinformation from the web. So it's something worth keeping in mind, I think.
Thanks, Greg. Agatha, do you have a point to make around sort of optimal policy design for advertising?
I would like to, add basically on what we said on GDPR, 2 sentences, and also from the context of not adding extra layers when they are not needed. Basically, in talking about the GDPR, it lists already 6 legal bases for processing personal data. And only one of these bases is consent. The Court of Justice of the European Union has confirmed that there is no hierarchy between them and that they are equally good, unlike saying you should go for consent because it's better. Clearly, there are instances when providing consent in the line of GDPR is appropriate in the light of the sensitivity of the processed information, but this is already guaranteed under GDPR. Hence, I believe we should not be adding extra layers of regulations for SMEs, to handle additionally when it's not needed.
Thank you, Agatha. There's an interesting question from the audience about whether it be reasonable to offer subscribers the quote-unquote profit cost for blocking the ad of a site and not collecting their information. I'm gonna hand this one to David.
Yes, I think it's a very important question, because it's important to clarify that no, the answer is no, because scale matters, and it's not when you're talking about very little amount of money, and obviously for such a little amount of money, it doesn't make sense to have a transaction between the visitor of the website and the ad provider, and this is the whole issue with the data economy. It's a scale issue. Things that work at scale do not work at the individual level. All the studies that have been done on the value of personal data have shown that people think they value their own personal data far more than the market value. So I think it's important to understand that this is not a thing that you just change the transaction and you solve the issue. It's a business model that works or doesn't work, and it only works at scale. So what is happening in reality is that there is innovation. What you are calling here profit cost for blocking is the subscription economy. So what we have seen now is in the last year is the dramatic rise of subscription-based services that they say, if you don't want to listen to the ad, you can pay for it. And that's what's happening, but it's happening at scale. It's not happening on the single individual visit. It can only happen by bundling service together. And this is something that is already happening on the market, and very much so. I mean, what we have personally as a user, what I see is a move away from an ad-based business model on the web over the last years. This is what I see as an individual user. I see less ads, not more ads that I used 10 or 15 years ago.
Thanks, David. Your comments on the value of individual data reminds me of something I read recently, that the data is sadly not oil, that we're all sitting on an oil well. It's more like sand. it becomes meaningful in the collective, but an individual grain isn't all that valuable. Another interesting question from the audience: isn't the call to ban more about the practices of certain ad platforms, and are there alternatives that can maintain targeted ads but stop the worst practices? Enrico, I'll let you take that one.
Thank you. I'd just also like to add something about what Agatha says. I completely agree with her statement on the different legal bases under the GDPR. I would also like to add quite often we forget that actually recital 47 on the GDPR clearly says that legitimate interest as a legal basis for data processing can be used for their marketing purposes. So there is this perception that it implies lower data protection, but if enforced rule of GDPRs are applied, this is not the case. There is no hierarchy between different legal bases, and this is also related to these questions. I agree that quite often the proposal for a ban, they mention mostly these large platforms, and this is a broader issue that should go hand in hand with also with competition policy, as it is now between the DSA and the DMA. The EU Observatory for Online Platform Economy clearly says that there is a lack of transparency that strengthens the position of these companies vis-a-vis both the users in terms of lack of transparency and privacy and the business users. So it's indeed about focusing on this increased transparency about the overall system and clearly enforcing the existing rules of the GDPR, which indeed provide already a choice and enough protection, but enforcement is still young.
Thanks, Enrico. We're going to start wrapping up, and I'm going to give every speaker the chance to offer a sort of final concluding statement and maybe also the vision for European digital economy going forward. Greg, let's start with you. What are your final thoughts?
Well, thank you for the discussion. It's interesting and insightful, and we are at the crunch time. It seems in the Parliament and maybe in the Council. So it seems like a good opportunity. From our perspective, the DSA matters, and it's a worthwhile consideration or investment of our time. But as long as it has this complementary value to the existing regulation and laws that are in place, rather than an instrument that tries to recreate something that is already there. So that would be probably my call for action to make sure we achieve that. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Over to you, David.
Thanks. I enjoyed myself. That was very interesting. I think the debate should be more not on the remedies, but on the problem. I still think that there is. I'm very curious to debate and to discuss and to understand what exactly is the problem we are talking about. And I missed it a bit today. So we are all in agreement. I think it's we should put back and the onus of the of the accusation to what is the problem? What is exactly that is not working in this specific field that is not working in the existing legislation? Because what is the gap in the existing legislation that we are trying to address? I think this is the key question we should have an answer to.
Thank you, David. Agatha, final thoughts?
Yes, thank you. To sum up basically of what I had the pleasure to discuss with you today and what I mentioned, in 3 sentences, I believe that the proposal to increase transparency by the Commission is actually desirable, and increasing the transparency of the digital services is in the interest of users as well as the intermediaries. However, I am concerned that the European Parliament is proposing a very different approach to the digital advertising, and if the proposals find themselves in the final text of the DSA, they will have a huge impact on the functioning of the online environment. I have a feeling that the rapporteurs did not find the right balance between the protecting users' privacy and preserving the functionality of the respective economic dimension of the internet. Bearing in mind of what we discussed today, I believe that the EU legislator should take a broader look at the issue of the digital advertising, taking due account to the interest of all the parties involved.
Thank you, Agatha. Enrico.
Thank you, Benjamin. No, I think that as the EU is trying to really present itself as a leader in global standards and find an increasing cooperation with other major economies, it's really indeed important to have risk-based approach and avoid this kind of significant setbacks for the overall digital economy, and try really to find the right balance between a data-driven economy for all players while sustaining user trust. And we should look at what we already have and better coordinate between different policy areas.
Thank you, Enrico. And over to you, Konrad. You had the first word and now also the last.
Thanks, Ben. I just wanted to say and put out there that I'm not against the idea of the DSA, because the e-commerce directive is 20 years old. And, the internet has changed and it requires a review. The other issue, is based on what David said earlier, which I totally agree, is that we need to understand what is the public policy issue that we're trying to address here, because that leads to scope creep. It makes it very, very complex and almost kind of unworkable. And often, as the case with EU legislation, it ends up being a compromise and a less than ideal solution. I think the talks of bans are highly divisive, and I think it'd be much better to really understand this problem and truly understand the unintended consequences of any policy recommendation.
Thank you, Konrad, and thank you all. I think you've helped contribute to a better understanding of the unintended consequence of how this could all play out. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you found this discussion stimulating, and see you next time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.